Brilliant work, Professor Anderson, the department chair said as my colleague finished presenting the research I'd spent 18 months developing. The audience of 300 academics at the annual sociology conference applauded enthusiastically. Professor Marcus Anderson stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Chicago Hilton, basking in recognition for work he hadn't done. I sat in the third row of the audience, clapping politely along with everyone else, watching Marcus claim credit for my research on income inequality and educational access. He described methodology I'd developed, cited findings I'd discovered, and presented conclusions I'd drawn. Every word of his presentation came from my work, repackaged with his name on the title slide and his face at the podium. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was a sociologist who studied power dynamics and inequality, and I'd been experiencing both for 5 years as Marcus systematically stole my research and built his academic reputation on my intellectual labor. I'd documented every instance of theft, gathered comprehensive evidence, and planned this moment carefully. Because in 30 minutes, I would take that same stage for my own presentation. And I would expose 5 years of academic fraud so completely that Marcus Anderson's career would be destroyed before he left the conference hotel. The ballroom was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The setting was beautiful, prestigious, exactly the kind of venue where academic careers were made and broken. Today it would be the site of Marcus's professional execution, witnessed by everyone who mattered in our field. I watched Marcus gesture confidently at his slides that showed graphs I'd created, tables I'd compiled, regression analyses I'd run. He was explaining my multi-level modeling approach to the audience as if he'd developed it himself. His voice was smooth and assured, the voice of someone who believed his own lies so completely that he could present them without visible guilt. Before we witness how an associate professor whose research was stolen for years used a single conference presentation to destroy her colleague's reputation while establishing her own, I want to thank you for being part of this community. A community that believes intellectual theft is as serious as any other stealing, and that academic fraud deserves exposure and consequences. If you've had your research stolen, if you've watched colleagues take credit for your work, if you've been the invisible intellect behind someone else's academic success, this story will resonate deeply. Hit that subscribe button to join thousands who appreciate stories where documentation and strategic patience overcome institutional power imbalances. Now let's step into the world of academic research where a brilliant woman's work was stolen by a charismatic colleague, where institutional hierarchies enabled exploitation, and where 5 years of careful documentation created the evidence needed for complete professional destruction. My name is Dr. Jennifer Kim, and I'm a 37-year-old associate professor of sociology at Northwestern University. I grew up in suburban Chicago, the daughter of Korean immigrant parents who ran a small dry cleaning business and emphasized education as the path to opportunities they'd never had. My parents worked 12-hour days 6 days a week, pressing clothes and managing their small business while ensuring I had every educational advantage. They couldn't help with my homework because English wasn't their first language, but they made sure I had tutors when I struggled and enrichment programs when I excelled. Education was their investment in my future, the thing they could give me that would open doors closed to them. I was always good with numbers and patterns, fascinated by the ways social structures shaped individual outcomes. In high school, I noticed how my Korean American friends from wealthier suburbs had access to advanced placement courses and college counseling that weren't available at my school. I noticed how zip codes predicted college attendance rates, how residential patterns determined educational opportunities. The patterns were everywhere once you started looking. In college at the University of Illinois, I discovered sociology as the perfect intersection of my analytical skills and my interest in inequality. I could study mathematically the patterns of advantage and disadvantage that determined people's life chances. I could quantify the ways that structural factors beyond individual control shaped outcomes. I could use data to prove what many people experienced but couldn't always articulate. My undergraduate thesis analyzed how school funding mechanisms perpetuated inequality across Illinois districts. I gathered property tax data, student outcome data, and demographic information for every district in the state. Then I ran statistical models showing how funding disparities explained achievement gaps even after controlling for other factors. The work was methodologically sophisticated for an undergraduate, earning departmental honors and encouraging me to pursue graduate study. I earned my PhD from Princeton, writing a dissertation on how residential segregation perpetuated educational inequality across generations. The work was methodologically rigorous and theoretically innovative, earning recognition in my field and leading to my position at Northwestern. I was hired as an assistant professor at 29, already establishing a reputation as a creative researcher with strong quantitative skills. The dissertation took 5 years of intensive work. I assembled datasets tracking families across 3 generations, linking residential patterns to educational outcomes over time. I developed new statistical techniques for analyzing intergenerational mobility when standard methods couldn't capture the complexity of how advantage and disadvantage transmitted across generations. The methodological innovations were significant enough that other researchers started adopting my techniques. My dissertation defense was attended by leading sociologists in my subfield, and the questions they asked were challenging but enthusiastic. They could see that my work represented a genuine methodological advance, not just another study using existing approaches. One committee member told me afterward that my analytical techniques would likely become standard practice in stratification research within a few years. That prediction proved accurate. Within 2 years of finishing my PhD, multiple studies had adopted my approach to measuring intergenerational effects. I was invited to give methodology workshops at other universities, teaching researchers how to implement my techniques. At 29, I was already building a reputation as someone who didn't just apply existing methods but develop new ones. Marcus Anderson joined Northwestern's sociology department the same year I did, also as an assistant professor. He was 32, charming and confident, with a PhD from Yale and a dissertation on cultural sociology that was more theoretical than empirical. Where I was quiet and data-focused, Marcus was charismatic and good at networking. Where I spent time in my office analyzing datasets, Marcus was visible at department events and university functions. Our offices were on the same floor, just 3 doors apart. The proximity meant we encountered each other frequently, stopping to chat in the hallway or grabbing coffee together between classes. Marcus was friendly and engaging, the kind of colleague who remembered personal details and asked follow-up questions about your life outside work. He seemed genuinely interested in other people, which made him popular in the department. We became friends during our first year, bonding over the shared experience of being new faculty members navigating academic politics and tenure requirements. Marcus would ask questions about my research methods and analytical techniques, saying he wanted to strengthen his quantitative skills. I was happy to help, viewing it as collegial mentorship between peers with complementary strengths. Those early conversations seemed innocent. Marcus would knock on my door and ask if I had a few minutes to explain some statistical concept he was struggling with. Could I walk him through how multi-level modeling worked? What was the difference between fixed effects and random effects approaches? How did you decide which control variables to include in regression analyses? I'd explain these concepts patiently, drawing diagrams on my whiteboard and recommending textbooks he might find helpful. Marcus was a good listener, asking intelligent follow-up questions and taking notes. He'd thank me enthusiastically, saying he was learning so much and that my explanations were clearer than anything he'd encountered in graduate school. Looking back now, I can see how he was systematically extracting my expertise while making me feel helpful and valued. He'd praise my teaching ability, say I should write a methodology textbook, suggest I was wasted on students when I could be training other researchers. The flattery was effective because it touched on something real. I was good at explaining complex methods clearly, and it felt good to be recognized for that skill. The theft started subtly during our second year at Northwestern. I'd share preliminary findings from my research with Marcus during our casual conversations, and later I'd see similar ideas in his conference presentations. When I'd mention this, he'd say great minds think alike, or that my insights had inspired him to explore similar questions. It seemed like normal academic exchange where ideas circulated and influenced each other. The first instance I remember clearly involved research I was doing on how neighborhood characteristics affected college enrollment patterns. I'd mentioned to Marcus over coffee that I was finding interesting variations in how neighborhood poverty rates predicted enrollment, with effects that differed based on the racial composition of neighborhoods. The interaction effect between poverty and race was complex and hadn't been documented in existing research. 3 months later, Marcus presented at a regional conference on exactly this topic. He'd analyzed different data than I was using, but the core finding was identical to what I'd shared with him. When I congratulated him on the presentation, he said he'd been inspired by our conversation to explore the question. Not that I'd told him about my findings, but that our discussion had sparked his thinking. The distinction seemed small but important. Marcus was framing my findings as inspiration rather than as my actual research he was presenting as his own. The subtle reframing allowed him to take credit while technically acknowledging some influence from our conversation. It was sophisticated theft, dressed up as collegial idea exchange. I told myself it was probably coincidence or at most parallel thinking. Sociologists studying similar questions with similar methods might arrive at similar findings independently. Maybe Marcus really had been inspired by our conversation to ask his own version of the question. Maybe I was being territorial about findings that weren't really unique to my work. But the pattern continued and escalated. Marcus started asking more detailed questions about my methodology, my data sources, my analytical approaches. I'd explain my techniques thinking we were having scholarly conversations, and then I'd see those exact methods appearing in his published papers without any acknowledgement that he'd learned them from me. One particularly galling example involved a technique I'd developed for handling missing data in longitudinal studies. Standard approaches to missing data worked poorly for the kind of intergenerational datasets I was using, so I developed a modified imputation method that accounted for the unique structure of my data. The innovation was technical and specific, not something someone would develop independently. I'd explained this method to Marcus in detail when he asked about my approach to missing data. I walked him through the logic, showed him my code, explained why standard techniques didn't work for this data structure. Marcus listened intently, asked clarifying questions, and thanked me for the explanation. 6 months later, Marcus published a paper in a good journal using exactly my missing data technique. The paper didn't cite me or acknowledge learning the method from me. Instead, Marcus presented the technique as his own methodological innovation, describing it as a novel approach he'd developed for handling missing data in complex datasets. When I read the published paper, I felt sick. The method description was almost word for word what I'd explained to him. The code structure was identical to what I'd shown him. Even the notation Marcus used matched my notation. This wasn't parallel thinking or coincidental similarity. This was direct theft of my methodology presented as his original contribution. I confronted Marcus about this, asking directly whether he thought he should have cited me given that I'd taught him the technique. Marcus looked puzzled, as if my concern was confusing. He said the missing data approach was a logical extension of existing imputation methods, not really anyone's intellectual property. He implied I was being overly possessive of a basic statistical technique. The gaslighting was subtle and effective. Marcus made it seem like I was claiming ownership of something that wasn't really mine to own, that I was being territorial about standard methodological tools. He suggested my concern reflected insecurity about my own work's originality rather than legitimate complaint about his theft. And because we were friends, because I wanted to believe the best of him, I half believed his version. By our 3rd year, Marcus was systematically mining my research for his own publications. He'd asked to see my working papers, claiming he wanted to learn from my approach. Then he'd publish papers using my methods, analyzing similar questions, and arriving at findings remarkably similar to mine but published under his name before my own work made it through the slow peer review process. The academic publication timeline enabled his theft in ways that weren't obvious to people outside academia. I'd spend 12 to 18 months developing research, analyzing data, writing and revising a paper until it met my own standards. Then I'd submit to a prestigious journal, where the peer review process typically took another 12 to 18 months before publication. From initial research to published paper was often a 3-year timeline. Meanwhile, Marcus would take my ideas and methods after I shared them with him, apply them quickly to readily available datasets, and submit to faster journals or present at conferences. His version would be public before mine, making it look like I was following his lead rather than the reverse. To anyone not knowing the behind-the-scenes timeline, it appeared that Marcus was the innovator and I was the one doing similar work. The professional cost was significant and cumulative. Marcus was getting credit for innovative methodologies I'd actually developed. He was building a reputation as a quantitative researcher based on techniques he'd learned from me. He was being invited to present at prestigious conferences and publish in top journals using work that was fundamentally mine. One of the most frustrating aspects was watching him get invited to give talks at other universities based on my stolen research. Universities would fly Marcus across the country to present my methodology as if it were his innovation. He'd give hour-long talks explaining techniques I'd taught him, accepting praise and questions from audiences who had no idea they were learning my work from someone who'd stolen it. These invited talks were important for building academic reputation and networking. They led to collaborations, publication opportunities, and general field visibility. Marcus was getting all these benefits while I remained relatively unknown despite doing the actual innovative work. He was becoming a star while I stayed obscure. Most damaging was the impact on tenure evaluation, the process that would determine our entire academic futures. Marcus and I were on similar timelines for tenure review, the crucial process that would determine whether we'd be promoted to associate professor with job security or let go from Northwestern. Tenure decisions were based heavily on research productivity and impact, measured through publications, citations, and professional recognition. Marcus was outpacing me on all these metrics because he was publishing my work faster than I could. His papers citing my methods were getting cited by other researchers, building his academic profile. His conference presentations on topics I'd pioneered were earning him invitations to prestigious speaking engagements. He was becoming known in our field while I remained relatively obscure despite doing more innovative work. The tenure packet comparison was stark. When we both submitted our materials during our 5th year, Marcus had 23 publications including 8 in top-tier journals. I had 16 publications including 5 in top-tier journals. Marcus had 42 invited talks at other universities. I had 18. Marcus had been cited 860 times. I'd been cited 430 times. On paper, Marcus looked like the more productive and impactful scholar. What the numbers didn't show was that much of Marcus's productivity came from stealing my work. His most cited papers used my methodological innovations. His invited talks presented my techniques. His top-tier publications analyzed questions I'd pioneered. The metrics made him look more successful, but the success was built on my intellectual labor. I started to push back more directly during our 4th year, telling Marcus explicitly that I felt uncomfortable with how closely his work resembled mine. But he was skilled at deflecting these conversations, suggesting I was being overly territorial about common methodological approaches, implying that basic analytical techniques couldn't be owned by any individual researcher, hinting that my concerns made me seem insecure about my own work's originality. One particularly memorable conversation happened in his office after I'd read yet another paper where he'd used my methods without citation. I knocked on his door and asked if we could talk about his recent publication. Marcus invited me in warmly, offering coffee and acting like this was just a friendly collegial chat. I said directly that I'd noticed his paper used the imputation technique I'd developed and taught him, and that I was hurt he hadn't cited me or acknowledged learning it from me. Marcus leaned back in his chair and looked at me with what seemed like genuine confusion and concern. He said he understood why I might feel that way, but that he viewed the imputation approach as a logical extension of existing methods rather than a unique innovation belonging to me. He suggested that in science, techniques evolved through collective development rather than individual invention. He implied that my desire for citation reflected a misunderstanding of how methodological knowledge circulated in academic communities. Then he added, in a tone of friendly concern, that he worried I was so focused on getting credit that I might be undermining my own reputation. He said people might view me as territorial or insecure if I kept raising these concerns. He suggested I focus on my own excellent work rather than worrying about who else was using similar methods. The conversation left me feeling confused and diminished. Marcus had taken my legitimate complaint about theft and reframed it as my personal problem with insecurity and territoriality. He'd made me feel like I was the one behaving inappropriately by asking for credit I deserved. The manipulation was subtle and psychologically sophisticated. The gaslighting was effective because it played on real dynamics in academic culture. Academia emphasizes sharing and collaboration, with norms against being overly possessive about ideas or methods. Complaining too loudly about credit could make you seem petty or not a team player. Marcus exploited these norms to make his theft seem like normal scholarly exchange and my objections seem like inappropriate possessiveness. I started doubting my own perceptions, questioning whether I was overreacting to coincidental similarities. Maybe Marcus really was developing similar ideas independently. Maybe my methods weren't as unique as I thought. Maybe I was being territorial about techniques that were actually common knowledge. The self-doubt was corrosive, making me second-guess legitimate concerns about systematic theft. The breakthrough in my understanding came during a conversation with a senior colleague, Professor Sarah Martinez, who'd been at Northwestern for 20 years. I'd mentioned casually to Sarah over lunch that Marcus and I seemed to be working on remarkably similar research despite different starting points. I framed it lightly, almost joking about the coincidence of our parallel work. Sarah put down her fork and looked at me seriously in a way that immediately shifted the tone of our conversation. Her expression wasn't light or amused. She looked concerned and somewhat angry, though not at me. She asked me to describe more specifically how Marcus's work resembled mine, when I'd shared my research with him, and what citations he'd included. As I explained the pattern, Sarah's expression darkened. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said something that changed everything for me. She said she'd seen this pattern before in academic departments. A senior male colleague systematically taking credit for a junior woman's work, staying just on the right side of obvious plagiarism while building his reputation on her intellectual labor. Academic exploitation disguised as collegial exchange. Sarah told me about a case she'd witnessed earlier in her career, where a brilliant woman researcher had her work stolen by a charismatic male colleague for years before anyone recognized the pattern. By the time the theft was exposed, the woman had left academia entirely, burned out by fighting for credit that should have been automatic. The thief had faced minimal consequences because he'd been careful to stay in gray areas where proving theft was difficult. Then Sarah said something crucial. She said documentation was essential if I wanted to stop this pattern. She told me to start keeping detailed records of every conversation with Marcus about my research, saving every email where I shared working papers or findings, tracking timelines of when I shared ideas versus when he published them. She said I needed comprehensive evidence if I wanted to expose the theft effectively. Sarah's words crystallized something I'd been avoiding recognizing. Marcus wasn't a colleague whose research happened to overlap with mine through coincidence or shared inspiration. He was deliberately mining my work, extracting my ideas and methods, and publishing them under his name faster than I could. It was systematic intellectual theft, not innocent parallel thinking. The realization was painful but clarifying. I'd been making excuses for Marcus, wanting to believe our friendship was genuine and his similarities to my work were coincidental. I'd been doubting my own perceptions because the alternative, accepting that a friend was systematically stealing from me, was too painful. Sarah's outside perspective gave me permission to trust what I'd been seeing. Following Sarah's advice, I began documenting everything comprehensively over the next 2 years. I created a detailed spreadsheet tracking every instance where I'd shared research with Marcus and when similar work appeared under his name. I kept dated notes of every conversation about my research, recording what I'd shared and when. I saved all emails, backing them up in multiple locations to ensure I couldn't lose the evidence. The documentation process was methodical and somewhat obsessive. After every conversation with Marcus where research came up, I'd return to my office and write detailed notes about what I'd shared, including the date and specific content of our discussion. When Marcus published or presented work, I'd add it to my spreadsheet with notes about how it related to research I'd shared with him previously. I started saving my working papers with date stamps, creating a clear record of when I'd completed preliminary versions of research. I tracked my own presentations at conferences and workshops, documenting when I'd publicly shared findings. The goal was to create a comprehensive timeline proving that my work consistently preceded Marcus's similar publications. I also began gathering evidence of Marcus accessing my files on the department's shared server. Northwestern's IT system kept logs of who accessed which files and when, and I requested my access logs periodically. The pattern was damning. Marcus had accessed my research files dozens of times, downloading working papers and data files without my knowledge or permission. The server logs showed Marcus accessing my files late at night or on weekends, times when he clearly didn't want to be observed. He'd download multiple files in a single session, suggesting systematic theft rather than occasional curiosity. And the timeline showed that his publications consistently followed shortly after accessing files with similar content. Over 2 years of systematic documentation, I built an overwhelming case. Marcus had taken credit for research methods I'd developed in at least 15 separate publications. He'd presented my findings as his own at 8 different conferences. He'd built his entire quantitative reputation on techniques and approaches he'd learned from me without acknowledgement. And he'd accessed my unpublished files without authorization dozens of times. Most damningly, I found several cases where I could trace direct connections between files Marcus had downloaded and papers he later published. I'd submit a file to the server on Monday. Marcus would access it Tuesday or Wednesday. Then 3 months later, a paper with remarkable similarity to that file would appear under his name. The pattern repeated across multiple publications. This was no longer ambiguous or deniable. Marcus had been systematically stealing my research through unauthorized access to my files and conversations where I'd shared work under the assumption of collegial confidentiality. The evidence was comprehensive, date-stamped, and supported by multiple types of documentation including emails, server logs, and testimony from colleagues. The question became how to expose the theft effectively. I could file a complaint through Northwestern's Research Integrity Office, but academic misconduct investigations were often slow, confidential, and subject to politics and power dynamics. The process could take years and might result in confidential sanctions that wouldn't affect Marcus's public reputation. I'd seen other misconduct cases disappear into bureaucratic processes that protected the institution's reputation more than they punished fraud. I could confront Marcus directly with my evidence, but he'd proven skilled at deflecting and gaslighting in our previous conversations. He'd likely deny everything, accuse me of misinterpreting collegial exchange, and potentially damage my reputation by framing me as an unstable colleague making false accusations. Direct confrontation without public exposure seemed likely to backfire. I could publicize the evidence through social media or academic blogs, but that approach risked looking unprofessional or vindictive. Academia has strong norms against airing grievances publicly, and exposing a colleague through informal channels might make me look bad even if my evidence was solid. I needed a strategy that felt professionally appropriate while still achieving public exposure. What I needed was a platform that was simultaneously public and professionally legitimate. A setting where presenting evidence of fraud would seem appropriate rather than vindictive. A context where the audience would be influential people in my field who could spread the story and support consequences. A moment dramatic enough that the exposure would be memorable and impactful. That's when I learned that both Marcus and I had been accepted to present at the American Sociological Association's annual conference, the most prestigious gathering in our field. The conference would be attended by 3,000 sociologists, including journal editors, department chairs, and the field's most influential researchers. Marcus was presenting on a panel about quantitative innovations in inequality research. I was presenting on a panel about academic ethics and research integrity. When I saw the conference program, I knew immediately this was the perfect platform. Marcus would present his stolen research in the morning to an audience of specialists in our subfield. I would present in the afternoon on a panel ostensibly about ethics in general, but I could use my slot to expose his specific fraud with comprehensive documentation projected on screens for everyone to see. The timing was perfect for maximum impact. Marcus would receive praise and recognition for my work in the morning. Then that same afternoon, I would systematically dismantle his reputation in front of many of the same people who'd just applauded him. The reversal would be stark and memorable, the kind of dramatic exposure that would spread through the field within hours. The conference setting also provided professional legitimacy for the exposure. I wouldn't be airing grievances on social media or filing anonymous complaints. I'd be presenting evidence in an academic setting, using my assigned presentation slot to discuss a case study in research fraud. It would look like professional scholarship rather than personal vendetta, even though the personal dimension was undeniable. The audience would include people who mattered for Marcus's career and my own. Journal editors who'd published his stolen work could issue retractions. Department chairs could factor the fraud into hiring and promotion decisions at their institutions. Senior scholars could withdraw collaboration offers and recommendation letters. The conference exposure would reach everyone who needed to know about Marcus's fraud. I spent 3 months preparing the presentation that would destroy Marcus while establishing my credibility. The preparation was meticulous, treating the exposure with the same rigor I'd applied to my research. I organized evidence chronologically to show the pattern of systematic theft. I created slides comparing our work side by side to make similarities undeniable. I prepared documentation of server logs proving unauthorized access. I gathered written statements from colleagues supporting my account. The presentation structure followed academic conventions while building toward devastating conclusions. I'd start with general discussion of research integrity issues, then introduce my case study without naming Marcus initially. I'd present evidence systematically, each example building on previous ones to show clear patterns. Only after establishing the pattern would I reveal that the colleague in question was Professor Marcus Anderson, sitting in the audience or at least present at the conference. The slides were designed for clarity and impact. Each piece of evidence was displayed with dates, sources, and context, making the theft obvious. Side-by-side comparisons of our work highlighted similarities too extensive to be coincidental. Server logs showed timestamps of Marcus accessing my files followed by publication dates of similar work. The visual presentation would make my case instantly comprehensible even to people unfamiliar with our specific research. I practiced the presentation repeatedly, timing it to fit the 40-minute slot while leaving time for questions. I rehearsed staying calm and professional even when describing painful examples of theft. I prepared answers to likely questions about why I hadn't reported through official channels sooner, why I was making this public, whether I'd offered Marcus a chance to respond. The preparation was comprehensive because I knew I'd only get one chance to make the case convincingly. Sarah Martinez helped me refine the presentation, offering feedback on tone and structure. She emphasized the importance of staying emotionally controlled, letting the evidence speak rather than appearing vindictive. She suggested framing the exposure as a case study valuable for understanding research fraud generally, not just personal grievance against Marcus specifically. The framing would make the presentation seem like scholarly contribution rather than personal attack. I also consulted with an attorney about potential legal implications of public fraud accusations. The attorney reviewed my evidence and confirmed it was sufficiently strong to support claims of research misconduct without risking defamation liability. The documentation was comprehensive enough that truth would be a complete defense to any legal challenge Marcus might attempt. The legal consultation gave me confidence to proceed without fear of lawsuits. The weeks before the conference were surreal. I'd see Marcus in department hallways and maintain pleasant superficial conversation, knowing I was about to destroy his career publicly. He had no idea what was coming. He was excited about his conference presentation, mentioning it casually in passing. He was looking forward to the recognition and networking opportunities. He had no inkling that those same opportunities would become the setting for his professional execution. Part of me felt guilty about the deception, about maintaining friendly pretense while planning his destruction. But then I'd remember 5 years of systematic theft, 5 years of watching him build a career on my work, 5 years of being invisible while he became a star using my research. The guilt would evaporate, replaced by cold determination to expose him completely. The conference was in Chicago, which meant most of Northwestern's sociology department would attend. The audience for my presentation would include colleagues who'd worked alongside both Marcus and me for years. They'd seen our research, noticed similarities, maybe wondered about the relationship between our work. They'd all be there when I revealed the truth with comprehensive documentation. I flew to Chicago 2 days before my presentation, wanting time to acclimate and do final preparation. I reviewed my evidence one final time, ensuring every claim was ironclad. I practiced the presentation in my hotel room, timing each section and refining transitions. I prepared myself emotionally for the exposure, knowing it would be intensely public and potentially confrontational. The morning of the conference, I attended Marcus's presentation on quantitative innovations in inequality research. The session was in a large ballroom with probably 200 people in attendance, a strong turnout reflecting Marcus's growing reputation in our subfield. I took a seat in the 3rd row, where I'd have a clear view of him presenting my stolen research. Marcus's presentation was polished and confident. He'd always been a good public speaker, charismatic and engaging with audiences. He made eye contact, used humor effectively, and explained complex methods clearly. Watching him perform was painful because I could see why people were impressed. If you didn't know he'd stolen the content, the presentation seemed brilliant. He presented findings from my research on educational inequality as if they were his discoveries. He explained my methodological innovations as if they were his techniques. He fielded questions about analytical approaches I'd developed, answering with authority because I'd taught him the material. The entire presentation was my work delivered by someone who'd stolen it. The audience responded enthusiastically. People asked engaged questions about the methodology and findings. Senior scholars praised the innovative approach. Journal editors expressed interest in publishing similar work. Marcus was receiving exactly the recognition and opportunities that should have been mine, all based on research he'd stolen. Watching him succeed using my work was the final motivation I needed to proceed without hesitation. Any residual doubt about whether I was overreacting or being unfair evaporated. Marcus was a thief building a career on stolen intellectual property, and he deserved complete exposure and professional destruction. The exposure I'd planned wasn't revenge. It was justice. After Marcus's presentation ended to strong applause, I approached him in the hallway outside the ballroom. Other audience members were congratulating him, and he was clearly enjoying the attention. When he saw me, his face lit up with a friendly smile, completely unsuspecting. "Jennifer, thanks for coming to my presentation. What did you think?" he asked warmly, as if we were just friends supporting each other's work. I smiled back, maintaining the pretense for a few more hours. "Great presentation, Marcus. Your afternoon session on research ethics should be interesting too. He looked confused, his smile faltering slightly. I don't have an afternoon session. I'm done presenting. Oh, I meant my presentation on research ethics this afternoon, I clarified, watching his face carefully. I think you'll find it particularly relevant to your work. You should definitely attend. Marcus's expression shifted to polite but slightly puzzled interest. He said sure, he'd try to stop by if he wasn't in other sessions. He clearly didn't understand the threat implicit in my words. He had no idea that in a few hours, I'd be presenting a case study of his systematic research theft to hundreds of colleagues. I watched him walk away, surrounded by admirers, completely oblivious to the professional destruction awaiting him. Part of me wanted to savor this moment, the last time Marcus Anderson would experience success and recognition in academic sociology. In a few hours, his reputation would be destroyed permanently. The hours between Marcus's presentation and mine felt surreal. I attended other conference sessions but couldn't focus on the content. My mind kept rehearsing my presentation, reviewing my evidence, anticipating how the audience might react. I felt nervous but also grimly excited about finally exposing the truth after 2 years of documentation. I had lunch with Sarah Martinez, who'd flown to Chicago specifically to support me. She asked how I was feeling, whether I was still committed to proceeding. I told her I'd never been more certain of anything. Sarah nodded approvingly and said she'd be in the front row, a visible presence of support when I needed it. My presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m. in one of the conference's largest ballrooms, the same room where Marcus had presented that morning. The panel was titled, Research Integrity and Ethical Challenges in Contemporary Sociology. I was the final presenter, following 3 colleagues who'd given standard talks about plagiarism detection software, proper citation practices, and conflicts of interest in funded research. The room was full when I arrived, probably 200 people, a strong attendance for an ethics panel that might otherwise seem dry. I recognized many faces including Northwestern colleagues, journal editors I'd submitted work to, and senior scholars whose research I admired. Marcus was not in the room, but his absence wouldn't matter. The destruction would be thorough regardless of whether he witnessed it personally. When my turn came, I took the podium and looked out at an audience of colleagues who'd known me as a quiet, competent researcher but not as someone particularly dramatic or confrontational. They were expecting a standard talk about research integrity. They were about to witness something very different. Thank you for attending this session, I began, my voice steady despite adrenaline coursing through me. My presentation today is titled, Systematic Research Theft, a Case Study in Academic Fraud. I'm going to present evidence that a colleague in my department has systematically stolen my research over 5 years, building his reputation on my intellectual labor while I remained largely invisible in our field. I watched confusion and shock ripple through the audience as they realized this wasn't the generic ethics talk they'd expected. People sat up straighter, attention suddenly focused completely. Northwestern colleagues exchanged glances, clearly wondering who I was talking about. This was already different from any conference presentation most of them had attended. I advanced to my first slide, which showed 2 publication timelines side by side. One timeline showed dates when I'd shared working papers with Marcus or discussed research with him. The other timeline showed when Marcus had submitted and published papers with remarkable similarity to my work. The pattern was visually striking, with Marcus's publications consistently appearing within months of me sharing related work with him. This is the publication record of Professor Marcus Anderson, who many of you just heard present this morning, I said, and the shock in the room intensified. People who'd attended Marcus's session that morning suddenly understood they were witnessing his public destruction. Notice the timing pattern. Each of these publications follows shortly after I shared related research with him. The audience was completely silent now, riveted by what was unfolding. I methodically walked through 15 examples of research theft, each one documented with emails showing me sharing work with Marcus, server logs showing him accessing my files, and side-by-side comparisons of our publications highlighting undeniable similarities. For each example, I showed the evidence chronologically. First, the email or documented conversation where I'd shared preliminary findings or methodology with Marcus. Then, the server logs showing him accessing related files on our shared network. Finally, his publication using the same methods, analyzing similar questions, and reaching similar conclusions. The pattern repeated across years and multiple research projects. The most damning examples involved methodological innovations clearly traceable to me. I showed how I'd developed the missing data imputation technique during my dissertation, how I'd explained it to Marcus in detail, and how he'd then published it as his own innovation. I displayed our code side by side, showing identical structure and even identical variable names proving he'd copied directly. I presented testimony from colleagues who'd witnessed me developing methods that Marcus later claimed as his innovations. Professor Martinez made a statement describing conversations where I'd explained my analytical approaches years before Marcus published similar techniques. Other colleagues confirmed dates of presentations where I'd shared preliminary findings later appearing in Marcus's work. One particularly devastating piece of evidence involved a working paper I'd posted to my personal website before sending it to journals. The paper included a novel approach to measuring intergenerational educational mobility. I showed website analytics proving Marcus had downloaded the paper multiple times. Then I displayed his publication from 6 months later using the exact same measurement approach without citing my working paper or acknowledging learning the technique from me. Most devastatingly, I showed several cases where Marcus had published my findings before my own papers cleared peer review, using his unauthorized access to my working papers to beat me to publication. I displayed the submission dates of my papers to prestigious journals, the dates Marcus accessed my files containing those same papers, and the dates he submitted similar work to faster journals. The timeline made his theft strategy obvious and calculated. The academic community watching understood the implications immediately. Marcus hadn't just been inspired by my work or working parallel to me through coincidence. He'd been deliberately stealing my research through exploitation of collegial trust and unauthorized file access. He'd systematically built his career on my intellectual labor while keeping me invisible. I showed email exchanges where Marcus had asked to see my working papers, to learn from my approach, then published remarkably similar work without acknowledgement. I displayed his published papers side by side with my earlier working papers, highlighting identical tables, similar graphs, and passages where his writing closely paraphrased mine. The presentation lasted 40 minutes, every minute packed with irrefutable evidence. I maintained a calm, professional tone throughout, letting the documentation speak for itself without dramatic flourishes or emotional appeals. The evidence was so comprehensive that theatrics would have been unnecessary and counterproductive. When I finished, the room was completely silent for several long seconds. People seemed to be processing what they'd just witnessed, a colleague's career being systematically dismantled with documentation so thorough that denial was impossible. Then one person started clapping, slowly at first, then others joined, and suddenly the entire audience was applauding. The applause wasn't polite or perfunctory. It was enthusiastic, sustained, the kind usually reserved for major intellectual breakthroughs. Except this wasn't celebrating new research. It was acknowledging exposure of fraud, validation of systematic theft, recognition that a wrong was being publicly corrected after years of invisible exploitation. The standing ovation continued for almost a minute, colleagues rising to their feet to acknowledge both my research and my courage in exposing fraud. I saw Northwestern colleagues applauding with particular enthusiasm, perhaps feeling guilty they hadn't noticed the pattern earlier. Journal editors were clapping while clearly processing implications for Marcus's publications they'd accepted. The moment felt like collective catharsis, the academic community expressing relief that fraud was being exposed rather than continued. The question and answer period that followed was remarkable in its intensity and support. Senior researchers asked technical questions about specific evidence, clearly already convinced but wanting to understand details for their own discussions of the case. They asked about the server logs, how I'd obtained them, whether Northwestern IT had confirmed their authenticity. They asked about timeline details, ensuring they understood the sequence of theft clearly. Journal editors asked whether I'd reported this through official channels, expressing concern about having published Marcus's fraudulent work. I explained that I'd consulted with Sarah Martinez and with Northwestern's Research Integrity Office, but had chosen public exposure as the most effective way to ensure consequences. The editors nodded understandingly, several making notes presumably about retractions they'd need to process. One particularly notable moment came when Professor David Chen, editor of one of sociology's top journals, stood and addressed the room. Dr. Kim, I've published 3 papers by Professor Anderson that appear in your presentation as examples of stolen research. Based on the evidence you've shown, I'm going to be issuing expressions of concern and potentially retracting those publications pending investigation. I'm also going to be publishing your original work as a priority submission given the circumstances. Other editors made similar statements, one after another. Within an hour of my presentation, Marcus Anderson was facing potential retraction of multiple publications, investigation by journal ethics committees, and complete professional discrediting. All of it happening in real time at the field's biggest conference with hundreds of witnesses. A graduate student asked how I'd maintained professional relationships with Marcus while documenting his theft. I explained that I'd prioritized gathering evidence over confrontation, recognizing that premature accusations might allow him to cover tracks or discredit me. The audience nodded appreciatively, understanding the strategic patience required. Several junior faculty members thanked me for exposing dynamics they'd experienced but hadn't felt empowered to address. Women and minority scholars described having their work stolen or undervalued by senior colleagues, feeling unable to complain without risking their careers. My exposure of Marcus seemed to give them permission to name their own experiences of intellectual exploitation. The session ran 20 minutes over schedule because questions and discussion continued. The panel organizers didn't cut me off, recognizing that what was happening was more important than adhering to schedule. The conversation had evolved beyond my specific case to broader discussion of how academic culture enabled research theft and what structural changes might prevent future exploitation. Marcus learned about the presentation from colleagues who texted him during my talk and the Q&A session. Multiple people later told me they'd seen him rushing toward the ballroom but arriving after I'd finished, finding a crowd of people discussing the evidence I'd presented. His face apparently went pale as he heard fragments of conversation about server logs, side-by-side comparisons, and systematic theft. I watched from across the room as Marcus tried to approach several colleagues, only to have them turn away or make excuses to leave. The social exile was immediate and visceral. People who'd been congratulating him that morning were now avoiding eye contact, distancing themselves from someone publicly exposed as a fraud. The shift was brutal and complete. Marcus tried to approach me, but Professor Martinez positioned herself between us, saying firmly, "I don't think that's appropriate right now, Marcus. You should probably consult with an attorney before having any conversations about this." Her tone made clear this was protective advice for me, not him, establishing that any approach toward me might constitute harassment. Northwestern's department chair, Professor Robert Williams, had attended my presentation and immediately recognized the crisis for our department. He pulled both Marcus and me aside, though separately, informing us he'd be initiating a formal investigation immediately and that Marcus would be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Marcus's face showed he understood his career was over. The rest of the conference became a surreal experience. I'd expected to feel nervous or anxious about the aftermath, worried about potential backlash or accusations that I'd behaved unprofessionally. Instead, I felt calm and deeply vindicated. After 5 years of being invisible while Marcus stole my work, I'd exposed him completely and established my own credibility simultaneously. Colleagues who'd barely acknowledged me for 5 years suddenly wanted to discuss my research. They asked about my current projects, expressed interest in collaboration, invited me to present at their universities. The invisibility that had characterized my career was replaced overnight with recognition and opportunities. Journal editors approached me with offers to fast-track publication of my work, recognizing that my research had been suppressed by Marcus's theft. They wanted to publish the original versions of studies Marcus had stolen, properly crediting me and correcting the academic record. Several journals offered to publish my work without standard peer review, trusting my credibility based on the meticulous documentation I'd presented. Conference attendees kept approaching me to discuss the case, often sharing their own experiences of having work stolen or seeing theft occur. My exposure of Marcus seemed to have opened space for others to acknowledge research fraud as a serious problem rather than rare aberration. The conversation continued through conference receptions and informal gatherings. Marcus left the conference early that afternoon, departing Chicago on the first available flight. His absence didn't stop the conversation about his theft. If anything, his departure seemed to confirm guilt, suggesting he couldn't face colleagues after being exposed so thoroughly. The story of my presentation spread rapidly through conference attendees and then to the broader field via social media and email. By evening, academic Twitter was discussing "The Reckoning," as someone had dubbed my presentation. The hashtag trended among academics, with people sharing the story and debating implications for research integrity. Some criticized me for exposing Marcus publicly rather than through confidential institutional channels, but most responses were supportive, recognizing that institutional processes often failed to address serious fraud adequately. Academic blogs picked up the story within days, analyzing the evidence I'd presented and discussing broader issues of research theft and credit. The discussion emphasized how my case illustrated structural problems in academia, particularly how publication timelines and collegial trust created opportunities for systematic exploitation. My specific experience became a case study for understanding how fraud happened and why victims often remained silent. Northwestern's investigation moved remarkably quickly given the comprehensiveness of my documentation. Within 6 weeks, a faculty committee had reviewed all evidence, interviewed witnesses, and concluded that Marcus had engaged in systematic research misconduct including unauthorized access to my files, plagiarism of unpublished work, and misappropriation of intellectual property. The investigation report was scathing in its conclusions. The committee found that Marcus had systematically and deliberately stolen colleagues' research over a period of at least 5 years, building his academic reputation on intellectual labor that was not his own. They documented patterns of unauthorized file access, publication of findings from working papers he'd accessed without permission, and failure to cite or acknowledge my contributions to his work. Marcus was terminated from Northwestern with cause, meaning he lost not just his job but also the severance and benefits that might have softened the blow. The termination was immediate, with Marcus given 2 weeks to clear his office and surrender university property. Security escorted him from campus after colleagues reported him attempting to access research files one final time. His publications were systematically retracted or corrected across multiple journals. Editors issued expressions of concern for papers where evidence of theft was clear, eventually retracting 9 papers entirely and issuing corrections to 6 others acknowledging that major portions had been based on my work without proper attribution. The retractions destroyed his publication record, leaving little of his claimed research productivity intact. Journal editors additionally blacklisted Marcus from submitting future research. Several journals added formal notes to their systems indicating he was not eligible to submit manuscripts due to confirmed research misconduct. The blacklisting effectively ended any possibility of academic publishing even if he somehow found another position. Professional societies revoked awards Marcus had received for stolen research. The American Sociological Association rescinded an early career award he'd won 2 years earlier based on publications now proven to be plagiarized. Other organizations withdrew recognition and expelled him from leadership positions he'd held. And most devastatingly for someone who'd built his identity around academic prestige, Marcus's reputation in sociology was permanently destroyed. The academic grapevine was remarkably efficient in spreading the story. Within months, every sociology department in the country knew Marcus Anderson's name as someone who'd committed serious research fraud, who'd systematically stolen a colleague's work for years, who'd been publicly exposed and destroyed at the field's largest conference. He was unemployable in academia, his Yale PhD essentially worthless because no institution would risk hiring someone with his history. The labor market for PhD sociologists was already competitive, and having a documented history of systematic research fraud made finding any academic position impossible. Marcus had destroyed his career completely through theft and exploitation. Meanwhile, my career was transformed overnight in exactly the opposite direction. The journals that retracted Marcus's publications invited me to submit my original versions, which were published rapidly given the circumstances. My citation counts increased dramatically as researchers working in my areas began citing my work properly rather than Marcus's stolen versions. I received offers from prestigious universities interested in recruiting me away from Northwestern. Berkeley, Michigan, and Duke all contacted me about potential positions, attracted both by my research quality and by my demonstrated integrity in exposing fraud. The offers included substantial salary increases and research support far beyond what I had at Northwestern. I seriously considered leaving Northwestern given that the department had enabled Marcus's theft through failure to notice obvious patterns. But ultimately I decided to stay and negotiate better conditions. I loved Chicago, had built a life there, and felt that departing would let Northwestern off easy after their failure to protect me. My negotiations with Northwestern were surprisingly productive. The administration was motivated to retain me both because of my obvious talent and because losing me would be another public relations disaster after the Marcus scandal. I secured a substantial raise, accelerated promotion to full professor, an endowed research chair, and significantly increased research funding and support staff. The endowed chair was particularly meaningful. It was named after a distinguished Korean-American sociologist who'd faced similar discrimination and invisibility during her career. Holding that chair felt like vindication not just for my specific experience but for all the scholars of color and women who'd had their work stolen or undervalued throughout academic history. I also won multiple awards that Marcus had previously been nominated for based on stolen research. The American Sociological Association gave me their award for innovative methodology, specifically noting that the honor was overdue given how long my work had been going uncredited. Other organizations followed suit, recognizing both my research quality and my courage in exposing fraud. The methodology award ceremony was particularly satisfying. The ASA president mentioned my case explicitly in her remarks, saying that my exposure of Marcus had prompted the association to examine how research theft happens and what structural changes might prevent it. She thanked me for refusing to accept exploitation silently and for using rigorous documentation to hold a colleague accountable for serious misconduct. Professional recognition that should have been mine years earlier finally arrived, along with explicit acknowledgement that it had been delayed by Marcus's theft. The recognition felt bittersweet in some ways, shadowed by awareness of the 5 years I'd spent invisible while someone else took credit for my work. But it was also deeply validating, confirming that my research was as innovative as I'd believed even when no one knew it was mine. 5 years after exposing Marcus at that conference, I'm 42 years old and a full professor with an endowed chair at Northwestern. I've published extensively, building on the methodological foundations that Marcus tried to steal. My work is widely cited, my techniques are taught in methodology courses across the country, and I'm recognized as a leader in quantitative sociology. I serve on editorial boards for multiple top journals, review grants for the National Science Foundation, and mentor junior faculty about protecting their intellectual property. I've become an advocate for changing the structural features of academia that enabled Marcus's theft, working to create systems that make exploitation harder and exposure easier. The experience with Marcus taught me painful but important lessons about academic culture and how it enables exploitation through structural factors that persist even after specific bad actors are removed. The slow publication timelines that let him beat me to press with stolen findings. The reluctance to question male colleagues whose work seems innovative. The assumption that the charismatic presenter deserves credit over the quiet researcher. The tendency to view complaints about credit as petty rather than as exposing serious misconduct. These structural issues would exist even with Marcus gone, creating opportunities for the next exploiter unless we actively work to change them. That's why I've devoted significant energy to institutional reform alongside my research. I chair Northwestern's Research Integrity Committee, developing better policies for protecting intellectual property, investigating misconduct claims more effectively, and creating reporting mechanisms that protect complainants from retaliation. I've written multiple papers about systematic credit theft in academia, using my experience as an anonymized case study to illustrate how exploitation happens and why victims often stay silent. The papers have been surprisingly impactful, cited widely in discussions about research integrity and academic culture. Making my painful experience into scholarly contribution felt like reclaiming power over a situation that had left me feeling powerless for years. I regularly give talks at other universities about research integrity and protecting intellectual property. I discuss my case explicitly when invited, walking audiences through how Marcus stole my work, how I documented the theft, and how I strategically chose the conference exposure. The talks always generate intense discussion and gratitude from junior scholars who've experienced similar exploitation but didn't know how to respond. One particularly meaningful aspect of this advocacy has been helping other researchers who've experienced similar theft. I receive regular emails from scholars, mostly women and people of color, describing situations that sound remarkably like my experience with Marcus. A charismatic colleague who asks too many questions about unpublished research. Patterns of similar publications appearing shortly after sharing work. Feelings that credit is being stolen but uncertainty about whether they're overreacting or being paranoid. To each person, I give the same advice Sarah Martinez gave me. Document everything comprehensively before taking action. Create a dated record proving your work preceded your colleagues through emails, server logs, presentation records, and witness statements. Build a case so thorough that denial becomes impossible. Then expose the theft strategically when you have both irrefutable evidence and an appropriate platform that protects you while maximizing impact. I explain that premature confrontation usually backfires, giving the thief opportunity to cover tracks or undermine your credibility. I emphasize patience and documentation over immediate action, even though waiting feels agonizing when you're watching someone steal your work. I share my timeline of 2 years documenting Marcus's theft before exposing him, explaining that the comprehensive evidence made the exposure unassailable. Several scholars I've advised have successfully exposed research theft using strategies similar to mine, presenting evidence at conferences or through journal editors rather than relying solely on institutional investigations. Each case reinforces that my experience wasn't unique, that academic credit theft is a widespread problem enabled by structural factors and power imbalances that make exploitation relatively easy and exposure difficult. Each successful exposure makes the next one slightly easier as norms shift and institutions begin taking these complaints more seriously. The Marcus Anderson scandal has become a reference point for discussing research fraud, a case that people know about and can point to when arguing that systematic theft happens and deserves serious consequences. The scandal has also become a standard teaching case in research ethics courses across the country. Faculty use it to discuss intellectual property boundaries, collegial relationships gone wrong, and the importance of documentation in fraud cases. Some use it to examine gender and race dynamics in academia, how exploitation often follows predictable patterns of dominant groups taking credit from marginalized scholars. Marcus's name has become synonymous with research fraud in sociology, his case taught to new graduate students as a cautionary tale about the consequences of theft. Instructors show my conference presentation as an example of how to expose fraud effectively, analyzing my documentation strategy and evidence presentation as a model for addressing misconduct. I've been contacted by researchers in other fields describing Marcus Anderson-like situations in biology, chemistry, computer science, and other disciplines. The dynamics seem remarkably consistent across fields. A more senior or more charismatic colleague systematically mines a quieter colleague's research, builds reputation on stolen work, and faces few consequences until a victim decides to expose the pattern comprehensively. These cross-field contacts have led to collaborative work on understanding and preventing research theft more broadly. I've co-authored papers with scholars from different disciplines examining common patterns in credit theft, structural factors that enable exploitation, and evidence-based strategies for institutional reform. The interdisciplinary work has been intellectually stimulating and practically impactful. I've met Marcus only once since the conference, accidentally in a bookstore in downtown Chicago about 3 years after his firing. He looked older, diminished somehow, wearing casual clothes rather than the professional attire he'd favored as a professor. We made brief eye contact and he turned away quickly, clearly not wanting any interaction. I felt no satisfaction in his obvious decline, no pleasure in seeing him reduced from confident professor to whatever he was doing now. Just a kind of sad recognition that he'd destroyed his own career through theft and exploitation when he could have built something legitimate on his actual talents. Marcus wasn't without ability. His theoretical work had been decent, his teaching evaluations were good, and his networking skills were genuine strengths. He could have had a successful academic career if he'd focused on his actual strengths rather than trying to build a quantitative reputation by stealing someone else's methodological innovations. But he couldn't accept that his strengths lay in theoretical cultural sociology rather than quantitative methods. He wanted the prestige that came with being seen as a methodological innovator without doing the actual work of innovation. That greed for unearned credit, that unwillingness to accept his own limitations, cost him everything. His downfall was entirely self-inflicted and avoidable. If Marcus had simply acknowledged learning methods from me, if he'd cited my working papers as inspiration for his studies, if he'd been honest about our intellectual relationship and his debt to my methodological training, he could have had a perfectly good career. Collaboration and acknowledgement are normal in academia and would have reflected well on both of us. But acknowledgement would have meant sharing credit rather than claiming it all for himself. Citation would have meant admitting that his quantitative skills came from learning from me rather than from his own brilliance. Honesty about our relationship would have positioned me as mentor rather than keeping me invisible while he shone. The academic community has long memory for scandal. Marcus Anderson will always be known as the professor who stole a colleague's research for 5 years and was publicly destroyed at a conference when she exposed him with comprehensive documentation. That reputation follows him permanently, making any return to academia impossible even if he wanted it. I occasionally wonder what Marcus is doing now. I've never searched for him online or asked mutual acquaintances, preferring to let him remain in my past. Some vindictive part of me hopes he's struggling, facing consequences for his theft every day. But mostly I just don't think about him, focused instead on my own research and on helping others avoid similar exploitation. Meanwhile, I'm recognized in sociology as a scholar who not only does innovative research but also had the courage and strategic intelligence to expose fraud rather than accepting exploitation quietly. That reputation brings opportunities, respect, and the satisfaction of knowing I fought back effectively against institutional betrayal. The recognition manifests in concrete ways. I'm invited to keynote major conferences, a speaking opportunity that went to Marcus before his exposure. I receive offers to collaborate with leading researchers who want to work with someone known for both methodological innovation and professional integrity. I'm consulted by journals and funding agencies about research integrity policies. Graduate students seek me out as a mentor specifically because they've heard about my experience and want to work with someone who'll protect their intellectual contributions. I take mentorship seriously, teaching students not just statistical methods but also how to document their work, protect their ideas, and advocate for proper credit. My research group has become known as a model for collaborative work that properly credits all contributors. We maintain detailed records of who develops which ideas, who runs which analyses, and who writes which sections. When we publish, authorship order reflects actual contributions rather than hierarchy. The transparency makes exploitation impossible and ensures everyone gets credit they deserve. If this story resonates with you, if you've had your intellectual work stolen in academic or professional contexts, remember that documentation is power and strategic patience beats impulsive confrontation. Build your case so thoroughly that denial becomes impossible. Choose your moment for exposure carefully, finding a platform that maximizes impact while protecting you professionally. Hit subscribe to join our community that believes intellectual theft deserves the same consequences as any other stealing. Share this story with someone whose research or creative work is being exploited by colleagues who won't give proper credit. And remember that the best revenge combines personal success with complete exposure of the thief. The quiet professor whose research was stolen for 5 years had the last word. A 40-minute conference presentation that destroyed Marcus Anderson's career while establishing Jennifer Kim's reputation as both brilliant researcher and fearless truth-teller. Sometimes justice comes not from institutions protecting you but from your own preparation meeting the perfect opportunity to expose fraud completely and publicly. Marcus thought he could build a career on my research because academic culture enabled that theft through structural features and power dynamics. He was half right. Academic culture did enable his theft for 5 years, making it easy to exploit collegial trust and slow publication timelines. What he didn't anticipate was that same academic culture, once presented with irrefutable evidence of fraud at a major conference, would turn on him completely and permanently. The colleague who'd sat quietly taking notes while he presented her stolen research stood at that same podium hours later and destroyed him systematically. The invisible woman became a recognized leader while the thief became unemployable. And the research that had been wrongly attributed for years was finally credited correctly, establishing my reputation while decimating his. That's what happens when you steal from someone patient, strategic, and meticulous about documentation. You think you're building a career on borrowed brilliance. Actually, you're building the evidence that will destroy you the moment your victim decides the time is right to expose the truth comprehensively. Marcus learned this lesson at the worst possible moment, in the aftermath of receiving applause for my stolen work, just hours before I took the same stage and presented evidence of his systematic theft to 300 colleagues who would spread the story throughout our field within days. The quiet professor destroyed the charismatic thief with documentation and strategic exposure. And academic sociology learned that research fraud, even sophisticated theft dressed up as coincidental parallel work, would eventually be exposed by victims who refused to stay silent and invisible forever. 5 years of theft, 2 years of documentation, 40 minutes of exposure, 1 destroyed career and 1 established reputation. That's the arithmetic of justice when exploitation meets comprehensive evidence and the courage to present it publicly. The woman who sat applauding while her colleague presented her research as his own had already won. She just hadn't told him yet.